Now the 22nd chapter. After these things, God tested Abraham. He said to him, Abraham, and Abraham said, Here I am. God said, Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah, and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men, in other words, his slaves, with him, and his son Isaac. He cut the wood for the burnt offering and set out and went to the place in the distance that God had shown him. On the 3rd day, Abraham looked up and saw the place far away. And then he said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go on over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. So Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. So the 2 of them walked on together. Isaac said to his father Abraham, Father. And Abraham said, Here I am, son. And Isaac said, The fire and the wood are here, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? And Abraham said, God himself will provide the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So the 2 of them walked on together. When they came to the place that God had shown him, Abraham built an altar there and laid the wood in order. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to kill his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. And he said, Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. And Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. And so Abraham called that place, The Lord will provide. As it is said to this day, On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. I have a 3-year-old grandson by the name of Benjamin. And in the last few months, Benjamin has learned those 2 words that every three-year-old inevitably learns. It's mine. Started a few months ago. He and his older brother Liam were playing with some little tiny miniature cars on the floor of our den, and Liam reached for a car, and Benjamin reached and grasped it. And he said, It's mine. It's mine. It's the kind of thing that we've come to learn is inevitable in the growing up process, isn't it? That moment when we begin to claim things as our own. Benjamin is a rather aggressive child, and recently he has taken to commandeering my favorite leather recliner. We have a picture here, I think. There he is. He really looks sweet there, doesn't he? Trust me, this child is a little monster. You see that little grin of his? He's just grinning and he's teasing me. He's daring me to take the recliner from him. If I get close to him, he says, Stay away. And believe me, he will fight like a tiger to keep my favorite leather recliner. And thus begins his journey. His journey through life, where he begins to balance what is his and what is not his. When he begins that long struggle of figuring out how to live a life of gratitude and of thanksgiving every single day. You can take him down now. He's staring me down. We know the day will come, hopefully the day will come, when he will walk across the aisle of his university, hopefully my university, Southwestern University, and receive that degree. He will grasp it and say, Yes, it's mine. I worked for it. I earned it. It's the journey we all take. We make that first interview. We get the job. We say, Yes, we grasp it. It's mine. We get married. We buy our first home. It's ours. It's ours. The truth of the matter is that when we stop and think about this issue of gratitude, we know that it's never really that simple, is it? It's never really that simple. For instance, I think about that day when I crossed the stage and received my degree at Southwestern. And that's exactly what I thought. I thought, I've worked hard for this. I've earned it. I deserve it. It's mine. Later on, I was appointed to be a trustee at my university, where I've served for 20 years on the board of trustees. And I've learned a lot. I've learned about that decade so many years ago when the university almost went bankrupt. It was saved by the sacrifices and generosities of thousands of donors who said, we will not let this university die. I've learned about the professors and administrators who work and live sacrificially because they believe in the mission of the university. I have met thousands of donors who give large gifts and small in order to build the buildings and endow the scholarships that enable our children to go to Southwestern University. And you can tell the same story about your university as well. I'm reminded of that story that Zan Holmes told about the professor who was taking a walk around the quadrangle of the college on a very, very nice, bright autumn afternoon, and he had his little 4-year-old daughter with him, and she liked riding on his shoulders, and so he picked her up and put her on his shoulders, and they were walking around the quadrangle, and they ran into a friend of his, another professor, and after greeting each other, the professor looked up at her, and he said, well, Susie, my, you've grown. Look how tall you are. To which she replied, I'm not really this tall. I'm standing on the shoulders of my Father. And aren't we all? Those of us who have grown up and thrived in America, we're all standing on the shoulders of others. It's never really just mine or ours. The gift of gratitude, the power of knowing that it isn't really all about me or us, that everything we have in life comes to us as a gift from God. If you'll pick up your Old Testament and start where I mentioned a moment ago in the 12th chapter of Genesis, you'll read about Abraham and Sarah. Young couple, they get married, and the first thing they start thinking about is having children. And so they're probably teenagers when they get married, and they try to have a child, and they're unable to do so. They move into their 20s, and they think, surely we'll have not just a child, but lots of children in our 20s. They're unable to do so. And so it is in their 30s, and their 40s, and their 50s. They give up. They give up. And God comes to Abraham when he's 100 years old. And he says, Abraham, I'm going to give you a son. At one point, the idea is so ludicrous that Sarah literally laughs in the face of God. But God persists. Abraham, I'm going to give you a son, and one day he will be the father of great nations. That day comes, and Abraham and Sarah look at their child, Isaac, in precisely the same way that you looked at your child when he or she was born. And they knew that he was a gift from God. Pure gift. That they had no claim to him whatsoever, but that this child had come as a pure gift from God. And Isaac began to grow, and Abraham and Sarah began to make plans for their son. And the older Isaac grew, and the larger he grew, the more they began to think of him as their son, as their son. I don't know for sure. Genesis doesn't really give us all these details, but I suspect they started thinking about maybe sending him to prep school. After all, God had said he'd be the father of many nations, he'd be like a king. Maybe they'd send him to prep school, get him really good secondary education, then maybe he can get into one of the Ivy League schools, you know. They begin to think of him as their son. And then this remarkable, terrible day arrives. And God comes to Abraham and says, Abraham, I want him back. Give him back. And Abraham, faithful Abraham, who knows what kind of horrible inner struggle he went through. But faithful Abraham gathers up the firewood and the knife and his only son and begins the walk that we can hardly speak of up Mount Moriah. And then the Bible speaks to us in unbelievable specifics. It tells us that Abraham puts the wood on the altar, and then he puts his son on top of the wood. And then it tells us that he takes rope and bounds him to the altar. And then Abraham lifts the knife with which he will give Isaac back to God. How can we possibly understand this story? When I was about 7 or 8 years old, this is in the mid-50s, my father came home one day and he said, boys, guess what? I'm going to get to ride in an airplane. My father had joined the Navy during World War II, and so I guess he'd been on a ship, but he had never been on an airplane. He'd been appointed to a committee that meets in Nashville, and he was going to get on an airplane at Love Field and fly to Nashville. Love Field in 1950s didn't look like it looks these days. It was a lot simpler. I remember the day we took my father to Love Field. It was one of the most exciting days of my life. My mother and my two brothers and I, we got in the car and we drove to Love Field. And we went into the lobby and we watched this big lobby in the plate glass window as my father, no security back in those days, we watched as he walked out into the tarmac and then climbed up the stairs and entered that old propeller-driven airplane. And I'll never forget that moment, watching that airplane taxi down the runway, and the nose lift up, and finally it ascended into the skies. I'm sure that's where my love for flying was born. Probably it was in that moment that I said, one day I'm going to be a pilot and fly an airplane. After the plane disappeared, we went home, and that night as it got dark, we were lonely. It was dark, and my father had never been away from home before. And for the next 2 days, we were lonely and kind of sad. And then 2 or 3 nights later, the front door opened. My father had flown back into Love Field and gotten a taxi cab and come home, and the front door opened, and my two brothers and I went running to the front door and jumped into his arms and hugged him and kissed him and welcomed him home. After supper, my father went back to his bedroom to unpack his bag, and after a few minutes, he hollered. He said, boys, come back here. I've got something for you. We went running back to the bedroom, and he pulled out 3 gifts, one for me and one for each of my two brothers. And we were thrilled. This is so cool. He brought us gifts from Nashville. 2 or 3 months later, he had to make that same flight again. He came home. He said, I'm going to be in an airplane again. We went through the whole thing again. We piled in the car. We drove down to Love Field. We watched him walk out on the tarmac, take off in an airplane. 2 or 3 nights later, he came back through the front door. We went and jumped in his arms and hugged him and kissed him. After dinner, he called us back into his bedroom and he gave us gifts again. My father began to travel more and more, and we repeated this little practice over and over again until the night came when my father walked through the front door. And we went running to the front door and we said, what did you get us this time? The gift had become more important than the giver. In 1982, my mother called me and They were living in Houston. She said, Don, I've already talked to your two brothers. She said, your father has been diagnosed with a very rare form of cancer. He has a tumor. And he said they've decided to operate on him. She said, we feel very confident. We think everything's going to be okay. But it is a very serious surgery. I think you and your brothers ought to be here. And so we all boarded airplanes and flew down to Houston. And I'll never forget that morning sitting in the waiting room off of the operating suite, Methodist Hospital in Houston. Of course, I'd been in a place like that many, many times. As a pastor, I was not naive. I had been in many, many waiting rooms like that, sitting with other families. But now it was my family. It was my father. And I was not naive. I knew what was taking place behind those big double doors that led to the operating suite. As the surgeon raised his knife above my father's heart, I suddenly knew that each and every moment of his life had been a gift, never a claim. I suddenly knew that my father did not belong to me. He belonged to God. When Abraham came down off of that mountain, he was a changed man. He was never, ever the same. From that moment on, whenever he looked at his son Isaac, he looked at him and he said, thanks be to God. Whenever he looked at his aging wife Sarah, he said, thanks be to God. Whenever he saw the sun rising in the east or setting in the west, he said, thanks be to God. Whenever he looked at his own aging, trembling hands and felt the rising of the diaphragm in his abdomen and thought about the breath just breathed, he said, thanks be to God. In his old age, Abraham had learned the meaning of thanksgiving.